I will introduce you to our first speaker today. We've got two speakers. Bruce with the Champaign County Soil and Water Conservation District will be speaking second. And first we have Kris Reynolds with the American Farmland Trust, speaking about the Fall Covers for Spring Savings program, which I hope you guys have all heard a little bit about before and can get a little introduction and some in-depth information from Kris about. Take it away, Kris.
All right, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks for hosting this today. Much appreciated. American Farmland Trust, for those who aren't familiar with us, we're a national nonprofit organization whose mission is to save the land that sustains us, and we do so by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fall Cover for Spring Savings program here in Illinois. I want to give out special thanks to Dr. Emily Bruner, our Midwest Science Director, who put together this presentation and also did a lot of the work and did all of the work on the outcomes for the project, which I'll talk about in more depth later. So I hope to walk through this in the next 20 minutes and kind of talk about the program, how it began, and where we would like to see it go. So to give you a little bit of background about cover crop adoption in Illinois and where it began, where we are at currently, you know, in 2015, the nutrient loss reduction strategy in Illinois was adopted as part of the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force recommendations. This is a voluntary strategy for non-point source nutrient losses, also has a point source component to it as well, but we are focused mainly on the non-point source portion of it that comes from ag lands. And cover crops were a key strategy of the nutrient loss reduction strategy. You know, there's several infield management practices that are recommended to reduce phosphorus and nitrate loss. And when you look at cover crops in comparison to nutrient management, for example, cover crops have about a 30% reduction efficiency versus a 10% potential reduction for nutrient management. So they're very a very key strategy and component of the nutrient loss reduction strategy. But adoption has been low. It has been increasing over the years, but it's still nowhere where we need to be in order to reach the goals of the strategy. On this slide here, we're looking at several different ways where we are measuring cover crops, and for the most part, we have somewhere between 3 to 5%, somewhere around 750,000 acres out of our 24 million acres of cropland in Illinois. On the left, the Optus data, which that slide is courtesy of the Nature Conservancy, is taking a look at satellites, the Sentinel-2 satellite imagery data, and giving us a snapshot of cover crop adoption in all of the Huck 8 watersheds throughout Illinois. And so we're able to compare that to the National Ag Statistics Survey, the NREC NASS survey that has been completed, and also the Ag Census. So during this time, you know, we also look at, you know, in 2015, we also had a state budget crisis going on. We also had the soil and water conservation districts. Staffing was cut and has been reduced. So a lot of different things going on once this strategy was rolled out. In 2017, our neighbors to the west in Iowa, we saw them putting together a crop insurance discount for cover crops. And what it amounts to is a $5 per acre premium discount on their crop insurance. A large majority of farmers take some type of revenue policy or other types of policies as protection. And so it's a very widely used program. It's also heavily subsidized through the Farm Bill. So when the Iowa program came out, they funded it at a $3 million over 3 years, 200,000 acres each year. You know, the key thing with the program is that the funding had to be transferred from the Department of Ag to the Risk Management Agency that oversees the crop insurance program. And so that was key. We looked at this and you know, $5 per acre. They were very successful in their first year. This reduces the crop insurance cost by about 25%. So we started to take a closer look at it here in Illinois with some of our partners. And so we knew that cover crops, you know, the research shows us that there are significant decreases in nutrient and sediment losses whenever we use cover crops in the rotation. But do cover crops reduce risk? Do they reduce risk to the point where there would be less crop insurance claims, for example? So I think one of the bright spots in Illinois, because of the poor budget situation that we're in Illinois, is that it has forced a lot of organizations to work together, to partner on several different fronts to try to promote the adoption of conservation practices. And so AFT pulled together several different organizations, and this is a list of all of the organizations that are currently partnering with us on this project. And as you can see, there's a lot of diversity within those organizations. We have conservation organizations, we have environmental organizations, we also have agriculture organizations as well. And so we pulled together all of these members of these very diverse organizations and said, you know, we see what Iowa's doing. Is it possible for us to get a program on the ground like that here in Illinois? And quite honestly, we all looked around at each other and said, there's no way that we can get something like this passed in Illinois, that we could get funding for this. Are you crazy? And then for whatever reason, we all decided that we needed to move forward on it. We needed to try to get this program. And I'm certainly glad that we had the support from all of these organizations and that we were able to keep moving forward. And I think AFT's role in that, within that committee, was just being, you know, that honest broker between the environmental groups and the agriculture groups and the conservation groups. So we set out to put forth, you know, some potential program goals and benefits. Obviously, we knew that we needed to get more cover crops on the ground. You know, could we get, you know, 200,000 additional acres by 2022? You know, could we start to see farmers thinking differently about cover crops by associating them with crop insurance and by listing them on crop insurance bills? Starting to get, you know, how can we get farmers to think more about cover crops as a risk reduction tool by making their soil more resilient? Obviously, improving water quality was a big goal as well, and working with the nutrient loss reduction strategy. When the NLRS came out in 2015, there was no new funding that had been allocated for any practices that were listed in the strategy. And also, of course, you know, looking at this as a very low-cost program compared to other current cost-share programs. At $5 an acre, that compares to an average of $30 per acre through some of our state and federal programs. Again, improving soil health and resiliency, and also thinking about how we could potentially get this as a pilot, how we could use this as a pilot program as we start discussions for the next farm bill here that'll be coming up in 2023. So we put together a proposed project budget over a 3-year period of time, starting out slow with 50,000 acres and eventually getting up to 200,000 acres. The first 2 years in Iowa, as I mentioned, they did around 300,000 acres, so they fell a little bit short of the available acres that they had, with a $1 million budget for 200,000 acres. So eligibility for the program, these are acres that are planted to cover crops in 2019, and then will be planted to an insurable crop in 2020. And they have to be planted outside of other state and federal incentive programs, so no double dipping when we look at who is eligible. We worked closely with the Department of Ag as an advisory committee to develop recommendations for the program. Ultimately, it was up to the Department of Ag to set the final guidelines for the program. And they decided on no acreage caps and applications being processed on a first come, first served basis. Also, no prioritization was used, and I'll talk about that a little bit later because it was discussed. The enrollment period was open from December 4th to January 15th. So in 2019, we did receive funding as an additional line item in the Department of Ag's budget for $300,000, and that would cover 50,000 acres at $5 an acre, and it'll also cover an additional $1 per acre for administrative and verification expenses to the Department of Ag and conservation districts. So we were able to get this in the budget. We were able to move forward with an enrollment period. The online application requirements included simple information about the applicant, the acres, typical information that's included for when a farmer certifies his acres with the Farm Service Agency office. So in FY20, as I mentioned, that sign-up period was held for a little over a month. The 50,000 acre cap was actually met in less than 2 weeks. So there was a great demand for the program. I, for one, was a little bit concerned with the 2019 crop year being what it was, with delayed planting in the spring, which also led to delayed harvest in the fall, just with the ability for farmers to get additional cover crop acres on the ground. So the total acres that ended up being applied for was 113,000. So we saw a great demand above and beyond what we had the capability to fund, and over 700 applications were received. So in FY20, and this is a lot of the work. This is the work that Dr. Emily Bruner put together after receiving the information from the Department of Ag. This is a look at where all 50,000 acres were enrolled, and also how many acres per county were enrolled. So we had really good coverage across Illinois. I think if we put up the entire 113,000 acre map, we would show almost complete coverage throughout the state of farmers that had applied and were interested. So again, very successful with really limited amounts of marketing for the program in its first year. So the 2020 outcomes that we wanted to look at were non-point source nutrient reductions, greenhouse gas and sediment load reductions. And we wanted to do that on a per county basis. And so we used the data from the program that we got from the Department of Ag. We also used the Comet Planner tool, and for greenhouse gas reductions, the nutrient loading from the science assessment was used. Oh, sorry about that. And looking at the Illinois Department of Ag Transect survey that the conservation districts do as a way to estimate annual sediment load reductions. So in FY20, as you can see from these maps, we were measuring phosphorus load reduction based on a county by county basis, and also nitrate load reductions. And as you can see, some of the counties that had some of the higher amounts of cover crop enrollment had some of the lower amounts of nutrient load reductions. And that is due in part to where they're at, the watershed that they're in, the topography in the watershed, and how that influences, the load reductions. And so we've been talking about this map. We've been talking about these findings as a way to have a discussion, a more in-depth discussion about the need for prioritization of where the acres are funded. And we want to make sure that we are utilizing every dollar that we can in this program to maximize the potential nutrient reductions from non-point sources throughout the state. So we'll see that is what we have been talking about for this next year. We'll see, with more acres that'll be available this next year, we'll see if we'll be able to do some type of prioritization, either based off of the priority watersheds in the state, or based off of our initial findings for the program this year. As I mentioned before, we also took a look at greenhouse gas emission reductions from the program. And again, this is just based on the 50,000 acres that were funded in the program. So the outcomes of the program kind of summed up with some really cool infographics here, you know, looking at almost 4,000 truckloads at 14 ton per truckload of sediment was kept out of the waterways, 14,000 pounds of phosphorus. Keep in mind, you know, that may not seem like very much, but we see a lot of issues. Our priority watersheds in Illinois are those areas that have greater than 2 pounds per acre of phosphorus being lost. So it doesn't take very much phosphorus to be of concern. So over 145,000 pounds of nitrate being kept in the field. Again, you know, when we have over 10 parts per million, some of our priority watersheds have greater than 20 parts per million, or 20, also 20 pounds per acre being lost. That is of concern as well. And again, the carbon dioxide equivalent of removing almost over 5,000 passenger cars from the road. So really excited about this program, you know, and the outcomes that we can get from this, and what we can share with legislators, what we can share with other farmers, of the good work that this program is able to do. So our next steps, you know, we're currently promoting the program. We currently have the 100,000 acres in the Department of Ag's budget, and as also mentioned in the governor's budget as well, with additional funds for admin and technical assistance going to the conservation districts. So we're in a very good position right now, going into this legislative session whenever hopefully it resumes. We'll be working on additional training and education opportunities, both for farmers and for the conservation districts around the state of Illinois. We've got a meeting set up next week where we'll be looking at evaluating, you know, the program and how we will want to expand it, you know, how we can make the application process even better for the farmers. We're also looking at ways that we can leverage and identify additional resources and funding resources. So there is some interest from private funders, private dollars, to help subsidize the program outside of the Illinois Department of Ag funding. So we're looking at ways that we can do that. We're also looking at ways to summarize the results from both Iowa and Illinois, and possibly do some survey work here in Illinois. And again, that is will be helpful to, as we think about this next farm bill, and potentially design a program on a federal level. And of course, just always looking for additional opportunities. So I will end with that. I hopefully have some time for questions at the end. Again, I thank all of our partners for being involved in this whole process over the last 2 years, and bringing it's a really great program that we've been able to bring to Illinois, and it's also caused other states around us to begin to look at it. And I think part of it is, you know, some of those other states are saying, well, if Illinois can do it, then surely we can do it. So excited to be a part of this, and excited to you know, to have all the partners and help that we've had along the way. More information, you know, check our website. Also send me an email there as well. So Lindsay, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, for sure, Kris. This program is so cool, and us at IAC are really proud to see how it's grown, and to see it become something actually on the ground happening. So I just want to remind everyone, you can pop questions into the chat box. And then I will introduce our next speaker, which is Bruce Henrikson, and he will be telling us about the S.T.A.R program, the Saving Tomorrow's Agriculture Resources program. And Bruce, are you ready? Yeah, you're sharing your screen now.
I think I'm ready.
Yep, great, thanks.
All right. Good day to all of you. I am a part-time employee at the Champaign County Can you hear me? Yes. You can hear Lindsay?
Yeah, you're cutting
Hello?
out a little bit. I think
Okay.
maybe I'll turn my video off and it'll save some bandwidth there.
All right.
Go ahead.
We'll try that. All right. Anyway, so part-time employee with the Champaign County Soil and Water Conservation District. Started 3 years ago. I've retired from Parkland College as an ag instructor and department chair. And very simply, one of the board members called me and said they had a new program that just had started and they needed some help. And that is, in fact, the S.T.A.R program. As soon as it was presented to me by those folks, I really think and thought then and still think this is something really needed. I am a farm kid. Originally in teaching agriculture, and I know farmers as well as people, some issues that I did the program, and I just appreciate this farm magazine that some of you met in there is that it's really, we've seen some changes in the last few years, increasing interest by farmers and farm groups in conservation. I mean, we've always talked about it here and there, but there's a lot more emphasis, as Kris had just explained, some of the new things that, at least relatively new things, that are happening for conservation purposes. So first question then is usually, well, what is S.T.A.R? And really simply, it is a free tool that
Hey, Bruce, we're having some.
I'm going to evaluate nutrient loss practices.
Bruce. Hey, Bruce, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
We're having some trouble hearing you, so I think.
Yes.
I think maybe
Yes.
you can call in.
Yes.
Can you call in on your phone and maybe that we'll be able to hear you a little clearer?
Sure.
Let's try that, and then while we get you, there you go. We can hear you a little better now.
All right. Good. Good. So, as I said, the two farmers, the whole program, and who decided they really wanted to make a career out of this, some kind of program, and I think that's important. And then ultimately, as I said, the farmers get to be, or the landowner is given a S.T.A.R rating for each field that they choose to have evaluated. So the reason then why we really have the S.T.A.R program, why it was created, was because those two farmers in particular, Steve and Joe, were already doing some conservation practices and were concerned about the things that they were hearing and seeing as a part of the conservation district, that, you know, we were still having so many problems with nutrient loss. And of course, the 2015 nutrient loss reduction strategy and the goals that were set by that certainly had a great influence on them as individuals, saying, what can we do to increase the likelihood that other farmers would start to use conservation practices? So ultimately, the NLRS was a great influence on those two coming up with some ideas of what to do to improve, again, the water quality especially. Then, at the same time, two farmers who've been around for a while were very concerned that if farmers and landowners did not make some changes on a voluntary basis, we know what can happen. And very simply, most farmers do not want the government to come in and say, here's what you will do or what you will not do. And after seeing that happen already in some other states, including Delaware, Ohio, and even to some extent Iowa, there was a concern that we better try to see if we can't get farmers, landowners, motivated to make the changes on their own. So the next question would be, how does S.T.A.R really work? S.T.A.R works because there is, as I mentioned, a field formed that is very simple. And that's one of the things that they came up with very early, that if it gets complicated, then farmers, landowners will not take the time to actually do the evaluation. They had seen other programs that are out there that kind of do what S.T.A.R ultimately does, but they were all very, very complicated, too time consuming. And very simply, again, they wanted to be sure that it was kept free. And so that's been one of the first stages or one of the first steps in the whole process. And so then, as I said, a farmer fills out the form for that one field. Usually takes about 4 minutes to fill out the form for one field. And very simply, then that's turned into the reviewer in the particular county or district in which that field exists. Someone in that county will then take care of doing the reviewing. One of the things we've also tried to emphasize is that nobody else will see that information or data, because certainly a lot of farmers and other individuals are concerned about who has my data. We know Google has everything, but otherwise we don't want everyone else in the world to know what I'm doing on my farm. And then from the field, once the evaluation is actually accomplished, there are points assigned for each of those practices, and then that set of points is converted into an actual score, as I said, that becomes the S.T.A.R rating. And in fact, if you go to our website, which is, so it's Champaign County Stormwater Conservation District.com, you'll find a number of things there that can give you a lot more details if you want to take time to do that at some point. And the other things I would emphasize is, at this point, we talk about, well, the practices that are shown on that form, who decides what practices should be evaluated and how many points should be established for those various practices that are used. And that's done by our science committee. Our science committee, by the way, I'll just go ahead and give you the names very quickly. Dr. Emily Bruner, that was mentioned by Kris a while ago from American Farmland Trust. Aaron Bush, who is our resource conservationist in Champaign County. Lowell Gentry from U of I, NRES. Doug Guker, who's extension educator, U of I. Dan Schaefer, who is works with the Illinois Fertilizer Chemical Association. Eric Miller, a farmer who does also cooperate a lot with NREC research. Dr. Emerson Nessiger from U of I, crop production, and Brett Roberts, state conservation agronomist at USDA, as well as Joe Rotherbaum, who, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the two guys that started it, because he's done a lot of research on his farm. So those are kind of important, and we think that people who are considering using this recognize that there's some real science behind every decision that's been made. Certainly some of the things that Kris talked about fit in very well with the discussion. For example, as the practices were considered and points established, it was a lot based on those same kinds of research things that Kris was talking about. What's really important? Cover crops is probably more important than a lot of things. Some other things, like we do ask for things such as, do you do soil sampling? How often? Do you use a GPS when you take the samples? In and of themselves, someone who's doing soil sampling does not solve any problems, because obviously they're not reducing nutrients just because they measure them. But the committee's always felt like there's at least some measure there that says the person who's pulling samples is concerned about nutrient management and is going to do a better job. If we had access to the slides, the next thing I do is just show you a little bit of a breakdown of a slide, of a field form, excuse me, and showing some of the points that would be established, just as a quick example of that. And also talk about how making just a few changes from the example that I show on the screen from that original one can then quickly change from, for example, the one I used is a 3-star field, but just by making a couple of changes in practices becomes a 4-star field, and makes another change in the practices by that particular field, and it's suddenly a 5-star field. So those are the parts that we hopefully are going to conclude as we do that. Now,
hey Bruce, I pulled up the field form just from the website, so if people want to take a quick look at it, I think they can see it on my screen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and so as you see, it's divided into sections, and so cover crops happens to be the first one. But it's been interesting as we have farmers and landowners who complete these things. For example, I had a farmer I talked to a couple years ago, and he started looking at the form because I was trying to get him, a former student, by the way, I was trying to get him to go ahead and fill out the form. And I knew he was a fairly large farmer operation with a family. And he looked at the first thing and said, oh, cover crops. Oh, we tried that one year and it didn't work. And unfortunately, that sometimes is the attitude of some people. And one of my conclusions in these 3 years of working with the program is that I'm kind of disappointed how many farmers don't have enough information to make good economic decisions. And it's why one of the emphasized things we are talking about right now is how do we make sure that more and more farmers really understand. And so, for example, we worked a lot with something called Precision Conservation Management, PCM, some of you've heard of, sponsored by the Illinois Corn Growers Association. And they've been very helpful. And very simply, we're really encouraging farmers to consider being a part of that program because they will get some of that information and, frankly, some of the education that many of them really need. So anyway, with that said, the other parts of what we want to do is talk about, well, how do we actually get to the point of participating? If some of you, for example, own farmland or operator, then the simplest way is go into our website, which is www.starfreetool.com. I've already given you our Champaign County website, which is fine, it's good stuff, but generally in the bigger world of the state, for example, we try to promote the S.T.A.R free tool as a simple way to remember how to get access to it. And as a result, we think that there's 3 different ways to do that, actually participate. I'm not going to get into those, but I do want to just quickly talk about what are the benefits then. As we talk to farmers and landowners, that's certainly one of the first questions. In fact, too often the farmer says, are you going to pay me to do this? And of course, we don't have money to pay people. As I said, we're trying to get this to be a voluntary type of program and change in behavior. But there are some things that I list. For example, we know that if more people use S.T.A.R and attempt to do things to improve their score, then ultimately that will decrease nutrient and soil sediment losses. But it also can help farmers who are seeking those cost share dollars for the state of Illinois, for sure. There are some programs referred to, as I said, as cost share. And in fact, starting with the 2020 fiscal year, the state of Illinois is going to require anyone who gets state cost share funds, they must complete the field form for any particular field that's getting those share dollars. So that's certainly already helped us a little bit with motivating people to be involved with the program. The other things that we think S.T.A.R can really do is help with the image of agriculture. One of my favorite stories is one of those slides I showed you had a picture of a field sign, as we call it. Anyone who participates and would like a field sign is given one for free. Those signs are being sponsored now by 2 major organizations, Farm Credit of Illinois and Compeer Financial in the northern part of the state. Farm Credit Illinois is pretty much the southern half of the state. And so we're seeing some signs placed by farmers who use the program. And very simply, one of the farmers called me last year and said that he put a sign out, and one of the neighbors stopped by who had nothing to do with farming and wanted to know what that sign was. And so the farmer was able then to share a little bit about, well, this is a symbol of what I'm trying to do differently to improve conservation, to reduce the amount of nutrient losses and so on. And certainly we'd like to see that. I like to see a lot more anecdotal stories like that one. Some other things that we're talking about that's important is as more and more farmers start to use the program, we think it could have an impact on how they might get more farmland as far as leasing. Obviously, there are landowners who, some at least, we hope most, do care about what happens with the environment around their own farmland, and perhaps they would be much more willing to rent the land to some farm operator who's going to be doing some things like we promote with the S.T.A.R program. We have some other ideas that may happen along the line. We're trying to find some supply chain firms who are willing to actually help encourage farm operators and landowners to participate in these conservation practices. So we're looking for ways to see if we can get those firms involved. I'll talk a little more about that in a couple of minutes. Another benefit that we just found out about last year was that the local sanitary group here in Champaign, Urbana, it's actually called Urbana-Champaign Sanitary District. We found out that they'd learned about the program, and since they actually contract with farmers to have the sludge spread on their fields, they decided to offer an extra bonus off the base fee based on each star rating improvement that they had on their operation. So someone with a 5-star field would get paid more to have the sludge applied there than someone getting only 3-star rating on that same field. So that's kind of been exciting to see how that's working. And we're already talking a little bit to some of the counties in the Chicago collar area to see if that may be something that they would like to promote and use as well. Lastly, I'll just talk quickly about the program and how well it's being accepted. As I said, we started 3 years ago, and within a few months, some of the other districts had heard about the program and were interested in participating. So we came up with what we call a license agreement, and started kind of spreading the word around the state that this is something that they could do if they wanted to. There's no charge. Again, Champaign County still is the owner, if you will, of the whole program, but there's no charge if somebody else wants to use it. And as of this last week, we now have 70 counties in Illinois that have signed a license agreement, and 2 actually in Indiana that heard about it and wanted to participate. So we're kind of pleased about that and foresee more getting on board in the future. And in addition to that, in this winter, had several states, particularly Iowa and Missouri, who were interested in offering the program in those states. So the people who work with the conservation district state associations in both states have actually signed an MOU to begin the program. We know that Iowa has already been started. They actually have identified their science committee as of last week and started meeting. So we know they're on board and heading the right direction to get started this year. Another thing I'd mention is that the National Association of Conservation Districts actually voted in February to promote and support the whole program. So we are a nationally recognized program at this point and looking to expand that. In fact, yesterday, partly because of that resolution that had been passed, there was a person from the state of Colorado who works with their soil health organizations and contacted us and would like to know a little more about it because they could see already that the S.T.A.R program might be helpful to them. Just very quickly, just so that you know, we have increased the number of people who participated and actually had fields evaluated. The first year we had 78 people, and then in 2018 we had 181, but then this past current year, I guess 2019 crop year as we call it, we had 214. Now, that's not a huge increase, not a huge number, but we've gone from 7,500 acres up to 85,000 acres in 2019. And we're kind of excited about the future of how this can work, particularly as we work with some other entities that are helping us expand that. Last thing I'd mention perhaps is that we have worked with some supply chain firms, and one in particular, is ADM out of Decatur. They got involved with the program and trying to promote it among their 350,000 acres of corn that's produced and hauled to them, their elevators. And so they've set specific goals. They would like to have all their farm operators by 2023. They want to have at least 25% of those fields be 3-star rated. And by 2028, their goal is to have 50% of the fields 3-star rated and 25% even at a 5-star rating. And so what we see now is the industry really has bought into what we're trying to accomplish. They see that it's based on practices and not some other kind of measurement that might be really difficult and expensive. But they've also seen the advantages of how this program is leveraging the existence of the infrastructure we already have, which is the soil and water districts, and why involving them is a good thing for everyone involved. We also think that ultimately it's really clear that the S.T.A.R program, and as people start to improve their S.T.A.R ratings, that's also improving the soil health and resiliency of the soil that we have. So we're kind of excited again about the byproduct, if you will, of having less nutrient losses and again, less soil sediment losses. And we've already had a number of companies have asked us if we could help make this program grow even more. And that's why, again, some of these other states are involved and why we're excited about having more of them involved. So I'll stop with that and be sure there's time for questions.
Great, thanks, Bruce, and thanks everyone for your patience in sorting through all of that. But Bruce, thank you for walking us through all of that. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box. Anything for Bruce or for Kris about the fall covers for spring savings program. And then I will kind of catch them and read them aloud to Kris and Bruce. I've got one that's probably for either of you, Kris or Bruce. Joyce is asking about how Illinois is pretty far behind in meeting its nutrient pollution reduction goals. And with the increase in the Gulf dead zone and our state water quality concerns, how long do you guys see voluntary efforts continuing when it takes multiple decades to meet goals that we're already missing? Do you see the long-term impacts of these programs?
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, I think we've seen, unfortunately, an increase of some of these nutrients leaving the state of Illinois. You know, from the non-point source side, the point source folks are kind of taking care of things right now. The non-point source, you know, we're having issues with increased rainfall events, more intense rainfall events. So we've saw a 13% increase in water flow leaving the state of Illinois during this, you know, period of time that, you know, the biennial report looked at from, you know, that doesn't even include, you know, 2019. So, you know, I think we know what practices need to be done in order to help us reach the goals. All those, you know, those practices also are, because of the climate change, are becoming increasingly harder to do as well. So when I talk specifically about cover crops, that's a practice that's harder to manage whenever we have, you know, more rainfall, more intense rainfall events. You know, when our planting period is shortened, we have less days to actually get some of these practices done. So, you know, even with regulation, it would be very difficult. You know, so we're just trying to get, you know, trying to figure out, you know, the best way to do these practices, to get farmers to want to adopt the practices more. Obviously, you know, as many different ways that we can provide education and the technical resources that farmers need, we're going to continue to do that. You know, I think Illinois has a lot of great programs going that are very simple, like both of the programs that you heard about today. I mean, these are simple, small ways that we can promote, you know, the adoption of these conservation practices. But, you know, we certainly recognize that there's a lot of challenges to trying to adopt those practices with the current environment that we're in. And not to mention just, you know, I mean, commodity prices are low. I mean, farmers are very hesitant right now to adopt some new practices that might cost them money or be risky for them to do. So, you know, it's very challenging, certainly.
Yeah, I've got a little bit to add there. I think both these programs are really good examples of when you call them voluntary, I think it's underselling it a little bit. I think they both spoke about how, Bruce, I know you mentioned that the state of Illinois will be involving the S.T.A.R program in their state ag conservation leases. And then Kris's program certainly has an incentive, monetary incentive there. And then Bruce, you also talked about the industry drivers and the market demand for these conservation practices. So that's kind of that third angle. You have totally voluntary, you have totally mandatory legislated, and then you have those market demand where ADM and Kellogg's and these larger companies are saying that we incorporate these programs and these practices into our sustainability plans, and we expect our farmers to meet these things.
Yeah, of course, obviously we're looking for even more meat. We want them to just pay farmers directly to participate in the programs. And right now there's certainly some indirect payment. But the other thing I'd emphasize, what Kris said is 100% right. Again, when we look at some of the data for this last year, obviously because of rainfall, that certainly influenced some of the nutrient losses negatively, unfortunately. But beyond that, one of the things that we really talked about even in the last weeks with our steering committee is more emphasis on trying to be sure that the districts, as I said, we have a built-in infrastructure to help promote the S.T.A.R program, but more importantly, to help with farmers making better decisions. And so what we want to see is increasingly the people in the districts, the resource conservationists and whoever else is working there, to work directly with those farmers to say, gee, you scored 22 points and you only have a 2-star field, but if you just made this change, you could have increased that, which again, it's nice to hear that from my perspective as, oh yeah, you got a better S.T.A.R rating, but what are we really after? We're really after ways to reduce, again, the nutrient and soil sediment losses in the state so that ultimately we can improve the water quality throughout the, at least in our case, the Mississippi watershed. So, you know, there are things we still continue to work on, but well put, that we're getting some support, obviously, from the state. They've endorsed the program and showed that well practically by using this IDOA requirement. And you alluded to something I didn't mention earlier, which is at this point, all of the IDNR acre fields, which is, there's over 200 tenants. Bob Caven, he's been very supportive, and he's going to be asking all of their farmer tenants to complete S.T.A.R field forms as well.
Yeah, we're really proud of that too.
The state-owned land. Yep, so it's great.
Great, so I've got another question here. And I think you both touched on this, but they're asking if there's similar programs like these in other Midwestern states. And I know, Kris, your program's modeled after the Iowa program. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. You know, yeah. So currently Iowa and Illinois both have crop insurance premium discount programs. Wisconsin has a bill that is pending at this point where they could become the third state. Minnesota has also had discussions. There's been some preliminary discussions in Indiana and Ohio. So certainly, I think as we have been able to show the success of a program in 2 states so far, it will certainly gain traction and has certainly received a lot more attention. We are currently focusing on the U.S. Climate Alliance states in the Midwest to try to promote this program and to get it in those states, particularly as a not just a water quality program, but also, you know, thinking about the individual states' commitment to the U.S. Climate Alliance.
Great, and then Bruce, so both these programs are really cool because it's putting Illinois as a leader. Iowa kind of beat us to this one, but we're going to try to keep blowing it out of the water someday. But then with Bruce's program, the S.T.A.R program, it was totally thought up here in Illinois and kind of worked on here. And then Bruce, do you want to touch a little bit? I know you did already, but on how it's growing and what other states are picking it up?
Sure. I did mention that you know, not every county in Illinois has chosen even to connect with us. And I know that typically that's the practical side, that some of those district employees are a little hesitant about how much work will it take. And so we understand that. So we're trying to do a better job of explaining and teaching and showing the benefits that hopefully will be offset that way. Now, the other part, all right, sorry, I set my timer. That Iowa, as I mentioned, signed an MOU, but it's also already getting started. They've had their first science committee meeting just this last week. So they're off and running, and I assume they will be establishing. What I didn't talk about was maybe the timing that would fit in well with Iowa as well as Illinois. I talked about the crop year as being 2019, but that's based on the crop that was actually grown and harvested in 2019. And so what we're working on now, the science committee here in Champaign, will be working on the 2020 crop year form, which will be available by July 1st. And again, that'll be based on all of the activities that it took to actually grow the crop that would be harvested not till next fall. But really, all the things that we need to measure as far as practices will be done by July. Even if they side dress some nitrogen, for example, that would be done in the summer, and that would be the last practice that's going to be measured for our purposes. So we see that as Iowa. And then, as I mentioned, Missouri is waiting for more details on how to get started themselves. And then hopefully some other states, we've got other interests as well. we looked around. I've looked around to see, well, what else is out there? Is there something else that's already being used? We haven't really seen anything that's quite like this. Again, some of our supply chain firms, that's why they're interested. They've looked at things like, if you've ever heard of Field to Market, that's a different program. It does do something similar, but it doesn't go same direction. And so some of the people that have been directly involved with that believe this can go kind of sit right beside Field to Market as a program. So we think that there's some advantages. Again, the fact that it's free is important, but also that it's simple. So we're excited about what it can do.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bruce. We've got maybe 1 minute left if anyone has any last minute questions to pop over there in the chat box. When you were talking about that, Bruce, while we wait, I was just remembering something I think I've heard you say before, is just the versatility of this program. Here in the Midwest, we focus on nutrient pollution reduction. Right. But I know you've talked about how in other states or other regions where they may have different goals, like reducing water usage or different sorts of pollution, this right. could be tweaked.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because one of the things we try to emphasize, I may not have well enough, but it's based on the local resource concerns, wherever that is and whatever they are. When we were in Las Vegas at this national convention, one of the guys that was very encouraging was a guy from Minnesota. And he said, I've got a cow-calf operation. I've already looked at your form and I can see how I could make some changes in this for any cow-calf operation to still measure the things that would be concerns for their natural resources, which often is still water quality. But you're right, it's very adaptable. That's one of the reasons why so many people in other areas of the country are looking at it, because of those reasons.
Yeah, and it's a really cool program. And then, okay, so for our last question, Kris, I think someone's just asking which seed cover crop mixes work best in our region.
We don't have time for that, but I will just say, probably 80+% of the cover crops that are being used in Illinois are cereal rye. It's yep. the most versatile, can be planted the latest compared to others. Now, cereal rye does a great job for erosion control protection, sequestering nutrients, holding nutrients in place. There's other, there's certainly other cover crops out there that might, have deeper rooting depth when you look at annual ryegrass. And there's also great things that, some of our brassicas can do, but ideally, those have to be planted much earlier, sometime in September. So, it's always better to plant cover crops in a mix, to have multiple species within a mix for more diversity. But unfortunately, with, being able to get those cover crops established in a timely manner is one of the challenges. So that's why, cereal rye is so readily used across most of Illinois.
Great, thanks. And then just the last comment here in the chat is that Bonnie is saying that she appreciates this focus on long-term improvements as opposed to short-term gains that both of these programs really shoot for. And then we're 2 minutes over, and I just want to thank you guys for hopping on, bearing with us and sharing information about these programs. I think at the top we had about 60 people hop on, so pretty great turnout, and we really appreciate your guys' time to present these to us.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
you.
Lindsay.
Great.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much. And we'll share all this information and follow up.